The cathedral rose against a pewter sky, its ancient stones cold and indifferent as the November wind that rattled the stained glass windows, casting fractured colored light across the assembled nobility who had come to witness the union of two great houses. Lady Vivienne Ashworth stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that seemed to absorb the grey morning rather than reflect it, her hands steady despite the trembling in her heart as she gazed upon the man she was about to marry. Duke Alaric Ashford, whose dark eyes held nothing but ice as they swept over her with the same cursory interest one might give to a piece of furniture being delivered to one's home. The ceremony proceeded with all the grandeur befitting their stations, the bishop's voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling as he spoke of sacred bonds and eternal devotion, words that rang hollow in Vivienne's ears as she felt the weight of every diplomatic negotiation, every political calculation that had led to this moment. Her father had spoken of duty, of the alliance between their families that would strengthen both their positions at court, of the honor of becoming a duchess. But he had not spoken of love, for love had never been part of this arrangement. As the bishop prompted them to face one another for their vows, Allaric took her hands with the mechanical precision of a man signing a contract, his touch neither warm nor cruel but simply absent of feeling, and when the moment came for him to lift her veil, his fingers brushed the delicate lace with such careful detachment that she understood she was not a bride to him but merely an obligation being fulfilled. The congregation watched with approving smiles as he raised the veil, revealing her face fully for the first time since she had entered the cathedral, and she saw something flicker in his expression, assessment, and perhaps, or mild surprise that she was not wholly unpleasant to look upon, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Then, as the bishop spoke the words that would bind them in matrimony, Allaric leaned forward as if to seal their union with the traditional kiss, and in that moment when his face was close enough that only she could hear, he whispered against her ear with devastating clarity, "You're beneath me." The words struck like a blade of ice sliding between her ribs, so quietly spoken that the watching crowd saw only a groom whispering sweet sentiments to his bride. But Vivienne felt the full weight of his contempt in those 4 syllables. He pulled back, his expression perfectly composed for their audience, and placed a brief, perfunctory kiss upon her lips that held all the warmth of winter frost. The cathedral erupted in polite applause. The bishop pronounced them man and wife, and Vivienne Ashford, for that was her name now, whether she willed it or not, felt something inside her crystallize into a diamond-hard resolve. She would endure this with dignity. She would hold her head high. She would not let this cold, cruel man see her break. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Ashford Manor rose from the moorland like a monument to aristocratic isolation, its countless windows reflecting nothing but grey skies and the bare branches of ancient oaks that lined the drive, and when Vivienne arrived as its new mistress, she felt the weight of its vastness settle upon her shoulders like a cloak woven from loneliness itself. The Duke had departed for London within hours of their wedding breakfast, offering neither explanation nor expected date of return, leaving her to navigate the labyrinthine corridors and cavernous rooms attended only by servants who watched her with the cautious curiosity one might direct toward an exotic bird, placed unexpectedly in a familiar cage. She established herself in the Duchess's apartments, rooms that had remained closed since the late Duke's mother had occupied them, and found them beautiful but cold, filled with furniture shrouded in holland covers and portraits of women who had come before her, all wearing the same expression of dignified resignation she now saw reflected in her own mirror. The household ran itself with the mechanical efficiency of long-established routine. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hendricks, presenting herself each morning for orders that Vivienne quickly learned were mere formalities, for the woman had managed these halls for 30 years and needed no instruction from a girl of 22, yet Vivienne approached each day with quiet competence, learning the rhythms of the estate, the names of every servant, the particular difficulties of managing a household that served a master who rarely graced it with his presence. She discovered that kindness, even small gestures of it, created ripples in the still waters of Ashford Manor, a word of thanks to the scullery maid, who brought her morning chocolate, genuine interest in the head gardener's arthritic hands, insistence that the aging footman not strain himself, carrying her trunks and slowly, almost imperceptibly, The servants' wariness transformed into something approaching respect, their postures softening when she passed, their responses becoming less rehearsed and more human. The Duke returned after a fortnight, appearing at dinner without warning or greeting, taking his seat at the distant head of the table as if she were merely another piece of furniture in the room, and when she attempted polite conversation about the estate, he responded with monosyllables that made clear her words were an unwelcome intrusion into his thoughts. His absences became a pattern she learned to predict. 3 days at the Manor, then a week in London, occasionally a month at his hunting lodge in Scotland, and during one of his London visits, she learned from a sympathetic lady's maid, whose sister worked in town, that the Duke maintained apartments there, and that those apartments were frequently visited by a woman of striking beauty and questionable reputation, a widow named Mrs. Delacroix, who had been his companion for years. The knowledge settled into Vivienne's chest like a stone dropped into dark water, sinking deeper with each day. Not because she loved him, how could she love a man who treated her with such indifference, but because it confirmed what she had already understood. She was not a wife but a political necessity, not a companion but a means to an heir he would eventually require. And until that time she would remain in this beautiful prison, maintaining his household, bearing his name, existing in the empty spaces between his more important pursuits. Weeks passed like water flowing beneath winter ice, and Vivienne found herself developing an unwanted habit of observation, noticing things about her husband that she wished remained invisible to her because ignorance would have been simpler than this growing catalogue of contradictions that troubled her quiet hours. She saw him once in the early morning, standing before the window of his study with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, his expression unguarded in a way it never was, when he knew himself observed, and there was such profound weariness etched into the lines around his eyes that she nearly spoke to him before remembering that he had made clear her words were unwelcome intrusions into his existence. Another time, during one of his brief returns from London, she encountered him in the corridor outside the drawing-room, and he opened his mouth as if to speak to her, his hand half raised in what might have been a gesture of greeting or reconciliation, but then something shuttered behind his eyes, and he merely nodded curtly before continuing past her, leaving her standing alone with the ghost of whatever words he had swallowed back down. The housekeeper mentioned, almost in passing during their morning review of household matters, that the Duke visited the old rose garden beyond the east terrace every time he returned to the Manor, always alone, always at dusk, and when Vivienne asked about it, Mrs. Hendrick's expression softened with something like sympathy, as she explained that it had been the late Duchess's favourite place, that she had tended those roses herself until illness had claimed her 7 years ago, and that the Duke had been a different man before her death, gentler somehow, less armoured against the world. The servants whispered sometimes when they thought she could not hear, speaking of how the old Duke, Alaric's father, had been a hard man who valued duty above all else and showed affection to no one, and how the current Duke had grown into a mirror of that coldness after his mother's passing, as if he had decided that caring for anything was a weakness he could no longer afford. Vivienne found herself managing the estate matters that her husband neglected during his absences, reviewing the accounts with the steward, approving necessary repairs to tenant cottages, corresponding with the land agent about crop rotations and drainage improvements, and she discovered a strange satisfaction in these tasks, in the tangible good she could accomplish even in this isolated existence. But the first true crack in her carefully maintained composure came on a grey afternoon when she found a small stack of her letters home, sitting on a table in the library, still sealed, the wax unbroken, and she realized with a sick feeling that he had not even bothered to open them, that her attempts to share some small piece of herself through written words had been so utterly beneath his notice that he had simply set them aside, like correspondence from tradesmen requiring no immediate response, and she stood there holding those rejected letters, feeling something inside her that had been bending under the weight of loneliness finally begin to fracture. 3 months had passed since their wedding when the Duke decided to host a dinner party at Ashford Manor, inviting neighbouring families of consequence, and Vivienne prepared for the evening with the meticulous care she brought to all her duties, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, her dark hair dressed simply but elegantly, determined to represent his household with the dignity he seemed incapable of recognizing in her. The dinner proceeded with all the formal choreography such events required, conversations flowing around topics of politics and hunting and the latest scandals from London, and Vivienne participated with the practiced grace her mother had instilled in her, attentive but not forward, contributing thoughtful observations when appropriate, until the conversation turned to the matter of the proposed railway expansion through the county. Lord Pemberton expressed concern about the disruption to traditional estates, and Vivienne, who had been studying the matter because it would affect several of their tenant farms, ventured an opinion that the railway might actually benefit agricultural communities by providing faster transport to markets, reducing spoilage and increasing profits for both landlords and farmers alike. The table had grown quiet, several guests nodding thoughtfully at her words, when the Duke's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "My wife has charming notions, but she lacks the understanding of such complex economic matters. Perhaps we should leave these discussions to those with the experience to comprehend them." The words landed with the weight of a public humiliation, and Vivienne felt the heat rise to her cheeks as the other guests quickly redirected their attention to their plates, embarrassed witnesses to her diminishment, and she sat frozen in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap beneath the concealment of the tablecloth, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will, while something inside her finally, irrevocably broke. She endured the remainder of the evening with a smile painted on her face, played the perfect hostess as guests departed, and accepted their compliments on the excellent dinner with gracious words that felt like ashes in her mouth. And when the last carriage had rolled away down the drive, and the Duke had retired to his study without a word to her, she climbed the stairs to her apartments with the slow, measured steps of someone walking toward an execution. That night, sitting at her writing desk while the fire burned low in the grate, Vivienne made the decision that would alter the course of her life. She would not endure this marriage any longer, would not spend the rest of her days being dismissed and degraded by a man who saw her as beneath his contempt, and with trembling hands, she drew out a fresh sheet of paper and began composing a letter to her family's solicitor in London, a man who had served her father for decades and whom she trusted to handle this matter with discretion. She wrote carefully, explaining her situation without excess emotion, detailing the grounds upon which an annulment might be sought, and when she had sealed the letter and hidden it in her writing case to be posted secretly through a trusted maid, she rose and began the quiet work of gathering her most precious personal effects, her mother's pearls, the miniature portrait of her sister, the books of poetry she had brought from home, tucking them away in a small trunk at the back of her dressing room, where they would not be noticed by the servants who attended her. As she worked in the lamplight, moving silently through rooms that had never truly felt like hers, Vivienne allowed herself one moment of grief for what this marriage might have been had she wed a different man, or had this man been capable of seeing her as something more than a political arrangement made flesh, and a single tear traced down her cheek before she brushed it away with fierce determination, refusing to waste any more of her heart on someone who had made clear he had no use for it. The following Tuesday, Vivienne informed Mrs. Hendricks that she required the carriage for a visit to her dressmaker in town, a perfectly reasonable errand that would raise no suspicion, and she dressed with particular care in a traveling costume of charcoal grey that seemed to match the overcast sky, her heart beating with nervous determination as the horses pulled the carriage away from Ashford Manor and down the winding drive toward the village and beyond it to the modest offices of Fitzwilliam and Sons, solicitors, where Mr. Edmund Fitzwilliam had served her family's legal interests for more than 30 years. The elderly solicitor greeted her with evident surprise and concern when she was shown into his private office, offering her tea and inquiring after her health, with the gentle courtesy of someone who had known her since childhood. And when she finally found the courage to explain why she had come, speaking in a low voice about the nature of her marriage and her desire to be free of it, his lined face grew grave with an expression that suggested he was not entirely shocked by her revelation. He listened without interruption as she detailed the circumstances, the Duke's persistent coldness and cruelty, the public humiliations, the complete absence of any marital intimacy or affection, and when she had finished speaking, Mr. Fitzwilliam steepled his fingers beneath his chin and regarded her with kind but serious eyes, as he explained that an annulment would indeed be possible given the grounds she described, that non-consummation, combined with documented evidence of emotional cruelty, could constitute basis for ecclesiastical dissolution, though the process would be delicate and would require her to demonstrate a clear separation from her husband's household. She must leave Ashford Manor, he told her, establishing residence elsewhere for a period of time to show the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, and she would need to gather any correspondence or witnesses who could attest to the Duke's treatment of her. And throughout this explanation, Vivienne felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, relief that escape was possible, and sorrow that her marriage had come to this cold legal dissolution. They agreed that she would depart the manor in 1 week's time, travelling to her family's smaller estate in Somerset, where she could reside while the annulment proceedings were initiated, and Mr. Fitzwilliam promised to begin preparing the necessary documents with utmost discretion, understanding that premature discovery of her intentions could complicate matters considerably. She left his office feeling both lighter and heavier than when she had arrived, the weight of her unhappiness slightly lifted by the prospect of freedom, but replaced by the gravity of the step she was taking, and as the carriage carried her back toward Ashford Manor, she watched the countryside roll past the window and wondered if she would feel any regret when she saw these fields and forests for the last time. What Vivienne did not know, could not have known, as she returned to the manor and went about her evening duties with careful normalcy, was that her lady's maid, young Catherine, who had served her with loyal devotion since her arrival, had mentioned to one of the footmen in an unguarded moment that the Duchess had seemed troubled of late and had been seen tucking items into a small trunk, and that this footman, whose primary allegiance was to the Duke's valet rather than to the household's mistress, had carried this tidbit of information upstairs, where it would eventually reach ears that would understand its significance, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform everything Vivienne believed about her future and her husband's capacity for change. It was Thursday evening when Harrison, the Duke's valet who had served him for 15 years with unquestioning discretion, knocked softly on the study door where Allaric sat, reviewing correspondence with little attention to the words before him, and when bidden to enter, the older man approached with the peculiar hesitation of someone bearing news he knew would be unwelcome, clearing his throat before speaking in measured tones about information that had reached him through the household staff regarding the Duchess's recent activities and intentions. The Duke's initial response was exactly what one might expect from a man of his arrogant disposition, a dismissive wave of the hand and a cold observation that his wife's comings and goings were of no particular concern to him, that she was free to visit dressmakers or whatever trivial pursuits occupied her time, and he turned back to his papers with the air of a man who considered the conversation concluded. But Harrison, who had known the Duke since boyhood and possessed certain liberties of long service, remained standing there in the lamplight until Allaric looked up with irritation and demanded to know what else the man wanted, and it was then that the valet mentioned the small trunk being packed in secret, the visit to a solicitor's office in town, the word annulment that had been overheard in whispered conversation, and something in the Duke's chest constricted with a sensation he could not immediately identify as he ordered Harrison to explain himself more clearly, his voice sharp with something that might have been anger but felt strangely like fear. When the full picture emerged that his wife intended to leave him, to dissolve their marriage and return to her family's estate, Alaric's first impulse was to laugh at the presumption of it, to scoff at the idea that she could simply walk away from a union that had been arranged by their families and sanctified by the church. But the laugh died in his throat as he sat there in his leather chair surrounded by the trappings of his wealth and position, and instead of amusement, he felt a creeping coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn draught seeping through the windows. He dismissed Harrison with a curt nod and sat alone in the study as the fire burned low, telling himself that he didn't care, that he would be better off without a wife who was proving troublesome, that he could easily find another match more suited to his status and expectations. Yet even as these thoughts formed in his mind, he found himself rising and walking through the manor with restless energy, noticing for the first time in months the changes that had taken place during Vivienne's residence. The entrance hall, which had always seemed cold and unwelcoming, now held fresh flowers in the Chinese vases his mother had collected, and the formal drawing room showed evidence of careful attention, cushions plumped, surfaces gleaming, the very air seeming warmer somehow than it had been before her arrival. He found himself in the servants' wing, where he overheard the housekeeper praising the Duchess's fairness in resolving a dispute between two maids, and later he noticed that the ledgers in his estate office, which he had been neglecting shamefully, were filled with Vivienne's precise handwriting, recording transactions and managing accounts he had left to languish. Something shifted in his chest as he stood there holding those ledgers, running his fingers over her careful notations, and for the first time since learning of her planned departure, the Duke felt a sensation he did not recognize because it was so foreign to his experience: panic, genuine and unvarnished. At the thought of this manor without her presence, of his life returning to the empty routine it had been before she came, of losing something he had never properly valued until faced with its absence, and though he could not yet name what he was feeling or understand why it mattered so much, Alaric Ashford spent that night pacing his chambers with growing dread, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor and knowing that something precious was slipping through his fingers like sand, though his pride would not yet allow him to acknowledge exactly what he stood to lose. Friday morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the morning mist, and the Duke found himself standing outside the breakfast room where he knew Vivienne took her morning tea, his hand raised to knock on the door in a gesture so foreign to him that he almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He who had never sought permission to enter any room in his own home, hesitating now like a schoolboy outside the headmaster's office. When he finally entered, Vivienne looked up from her correspondence with an expression of cool surprise. Her teacup paused halfway to her lips, and he found himself suddenly awkward and uncertain as he mumbled something about wishing to discuss household matters, though he had no household matters to discuss and they both knew it. She regarded him with those grey eyes that seemed to see through every pretense, responding with perfect politeness that she was at his disposal, gesturing to the chair across from her with a formality that cut him more deeply than any harsh word could have done. And as he sat there attempting to manufacture conversation about the upcoming harvest or the state of the tenant cottages, he noticed details about her that he had never bothered to observe before, the way she took her tea with a single lump of sugar and a precise measure of cream, the way her fingers traced the edge of her saucer when she was thinking, the way morning light caught in her dark hair and revealed shades of auburn he had never seen. He realized with a sensation approaching horror that he knew nothing about his own wife, nothing of her preferences or her thoughts, nothing of what made her smile or what caused her sorrow beyond the sorrow he himself had inflicted, and this ignorance seemed suddenly unforgivable in a way his deliberate cruelty had not. Their stilted conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes before Vivienne excused herself with impeccable courtesy to attend to her duties, leaving him sitting alone in the breakfast room, feeling more lost than he had since his mother's death. And throughout the day, he found himself seeking her out on various pretexts, catching glimpses of her in the library where she sat reading in the window seat, watching from his study window as she walked in the gardens with a book tucked under her arm, observing the graceful way she moved through the world he had tried so hard to make unwelcoming to her. That evening he was meant to travel to town for his weekly visit to his mistress, a habit he had maintained with callous regularity throughout his marriage, and he actually ordered his carriage prepared and dressed for the journey before something made him hesitate, some new and uncomfortable awareness that going to another woman, while his wife prepared to leave him forever, seemed not just cruel but somehow unbearable. He almost sent a note cancelling the engagement, his hand on the writing desk, the paper before him, but pride reasserted itself with familiar force. He would not let her change his habits and would not give her that power over him, would not admit even to himself that anything had shifted in his carefully ordered world. So he went, riding through the darkness toward the townhouse where his mistress awaited, but the evening stretched before him with leaden weight, the conversation seeming hollow, the company tedious in a way it had never been before, and he found himself making excuses and departing far earlier than usual, riding back toward Ashford Manor through the night with a restlessness he could not name, returning to find the manor dark and silent, except for the lamp still burning in Vivienne's window, and he stood in the courtyard looking up at that light and wondering what she was thinking, whether she was relieved by his absence or simply indifferent, whether there was any way to bridge the chasm he had so carefully constructed between them, though he could not yet admit why it suddenly seemed to matter so desperately that he try. Sunday morning found the Duke wandering through the east wing of the manor, a section he rarely visited, drawn there by some restless impulse he could not explain, and it was in the small sitting room that overlooked the rose garden where he discovered a piece of embroidery abandoned on the window seat. The needle still threaded through fabric that depicted a pastoral scene of remarkable delicacy and skill, half finished and left behind as though the maker had simply lost heart in the completion of it. He picked up the frame with unexpected gentleness, studying the tiny stitches that formed meadow flowers and distant hills, recognizing it as Vivienne's work, though he had never seen her engaged in such occupation, and something about its abandoned state, the way the threads trailed loose, the pattern incomplete, struck him with unexpected force as a metaphor for their entire marriage, something begun with care that had been left to languish through his neglect. He carried it with him as he continued his aimless exploration, finding himself drawn to his study where the estate ledgers lay open on his desk, and when he examined them more closely, he saw months of Vivienne's meticulous work recorded there, her handwriting flowing across pages he had left blank with his indifference, documenting expenditures and income, tenant concerns and household needs, managing the very foundations of his estate, while he had been too proud and too foolish to notice. The discovery sent him to the housekeeper's quarters, where Mrs. Brennan regarded him with barely concealed surprise when he asked about the Duchess's activities, and the older woman's response, delivered with the particular frankness of long service, detailed how Vivienne had personally intervened when a tenant family faced eviction due to illness, how she had established a fund for servants' medical needs, how she spent hours each week visiting the workers' cottages to ensure their welfare, accomplishments that spoke to a character of such natural nobility that his own aristocratic pretensions seemed hollow and meaningless by comparison. He stood there in the housekeeper's sitting room, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's quiet competence and genuine compassion, confronting the reality that she had been a better steward of his family's legacy in 3 months than he had been in the 5 years since inheriting the title, and his arrogance that carefully constructed armor he had worn since his father's death began to crack like ice under spring sun, revealing beneath it something raw and uncertain and desperately afraid. That evening he sought her out with a determination born of desperation, finding her in the library where she sat reading by lamplight, and he asked with an awkwardness that would have been comical had it not been so sincere whether she would join him for dinner. A simple request that should have required no courage yet cost him nearly everything to voice, and her response, delivered with impeccable politeness that somehow felt more cutting than any insult, was a gentle decline accompanied by the observation that she had already taken her meal and wished to retire early, leaving him standing alone among the books as she glided past him with the distant courtesy of a stranger. And he understood with crushing clarity that he had transformed his wife into exactly that, in a stranger in his own home, someone who looked at him with nothing in her eyes but cool indifference, and the realization that he had done this through his own cruelty, his own pride, his own determined blindness to the treasure that had been placed in his care, settled upon him with the weight of stones as he remained there in the empty library, holding the abandoned embroidery frame like a talisman of all he stood to lose, knowing that she would leave in 3 days and taking with her any possibility of redemption he might have hoped to find. Monday arrived with leaden skies that matched the weight in Allaric's chest, and he woke with the knowledge that Vivienne would leave in 2 days, settling upon him like a physical burden, prompting him to do something he had never done in his 5 years as Duke. He cancelled every appointment, every engagement, every obligation that might take him from the Manor, sending notes to his steward and his man of business and the various petitioners who sought his attention, claiming indisposition, though the only malady he suffered was one of his own making. He wandered through Ashford Manor as though seeing it for the first time, noticing details that Vivienne's presence had brought into being: fresh flowers in the entrance hall that had stood bare and cold for years, new curtains in the drawing room that admitted light where shadows had previously reigned, small touches of warmth and care that had transformed his ancestral home from a mausoleum of past glories into something that might have been called welcoming, and he understood with devastating clarity that when she left, she would take all of this with her, leaving behind only the cold emptiness he had thought himself content with before her arrival. The afternoon found him in the gardens, where he discovered her walking among the late-blooming roses, a shawl wrapped against the autumn chill, and he approached with the hesitation of a man walking toward his own judgment, finding words inadequate, and his usual arrogance useless as armor against the cool regard she turned upon him when he spoke her name. They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by flowers that would soon surrender to winter's approach, and he attempted to make conversation about inconsequential matters, the weather, the gardens, and the state of the roses, until she interrupted him with a directness that cut through all pretense, asking simply, "Why does it matter now?" The question hung between them like a blade, and he found himself unable to answer with anything approaching honesty, unable to say that he had only just begun to see her as a person rather than an inconvenient obligation, unable to admit that the thought of her absence had become unbearable in ways he could not yet fully comprehend, unable to confess that he might be falling in love with the wife he had so thoroughly scorned, and his silence spoke volumes that words could not have conveyed. She regarded him with those grey eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of their brief marriage, and she told him with quiet finality that she would be leaving in 2 days, departing at dawn on Wednesday, and he heard in her voice not anger, but a kind of gentle resignation that was somehow worse than any fury could have been, as though she had already mourned their marriage and moved beyond it, while he was only just beginning to understand what he stood to lose. He wanted to protest, to demand she stay, to order her as her husband to remain, but even he recognized that such commands would only prove her wisdom in leaving, and instead he stood mute and helpless as she excused herself with perfect courtesy and walked back toward the manor, her figure growing smaller against the vast stone facade of his family home, and he remained there alone among the roses as darkness gathered and the first cold drops of rain began to fall, feeling his carefully constructed world begin its inevitable collapse around him, understanding that he had built his life upon foundations of pride and arrogance that were now crumbling beneath the simple truth that he had wounded the one person who might have saved him from becoming the cold, empty man his father had been, and recognizing with the particular agony of revelation that comes too late that he did not want her to go, could not bear the thought of her absence, needed her in ways that terrified him with their intensity, though he had no idea how to tell her any of this, no vocabulary for vulnerability after years of practiced disdain, no way to bridge the chasm he had so deliberately created between them in the scant 2 days that remained before she would leave him forever. Tuesday dawned with a pallor that seemed to match the desperation in Allaric's soul, and he rose before first light, knowing this was his last full day before Vivienne's departure, the final hours in which he might somehow prevent the dissolution of a marriage he had only just begun to value, and his first action was one that cost him more pride than he had imagined he possessed. He sent word to his mistress in town that their arrangement was ended, permanently and without possibility of reconciliation, enclosing a generous settlement that felt like paying penance for sins he was only beginning to fully comprehend. The morning found him in his study with Edmund Graves, the elderly steward who had served his father and grandfather before him, a man whose discretion had always been absolute, but whose loyalty Allaric now desperately needed to transcend into honesty. And when he asked the old man to speak plainly about his conduct as both duke and husband, the silence that followed felt like judgment itself before Graves began to speak in measured tones about cruelty disguised as aristocratic privilege, about a young duchess who had tried with quiet dignity to be a worthy partner while being met with nothing but disdain, about servants who whispered their shock at how thoroughly the young duke had embraced his father's worst qualities, that cold distance, that casual cruelty, that absolute conviction that rank excused all manner of unkindness. The words struck Allaric with the force of physical blows, each observation a mirror held up to reflect what he had become, and he saw with devastating clarity that he had indeed transformed into the very man he had sworn as a grieving boy never to emulate. That distant father who had ruled Ashford Manor like a tyrant and died unmourned even by his own son, and the recognition that he had inflicted upon Vivienne the same loveless existence his mother had endured, sent him to his feet, pacing the study like a caged animal while something fundamental shifted in the architecture of his soul. He understood then, standing among his father's books and his grandfather's hunting trophies and all the accumulated weight of Ashford pride, that what he felt for Vivienne had transcended obligation or even attraction and become something he had no experience. Naming this aching need for her presence, this desperate desire to be worthy of her regard, this willingness to surrender every scrap of pride, if it meant she might look at him without that terrible polite distance in her eyes, and he recognized it finally as love, not the pleasant affection he had imagined. Marriage might eventually produce but something fierce and consuming that made mockery of everything he thought he had understood about himself. He spent the afternoon composing and discarding letters, trying to find words adequate to convey the transformation occurring within him, but every phrase seemed insufficient against the magnitude of what he needed to express, and finally he resolved to speak to her directly this evening, to lay himself bare before her judgment and beg not for forgiveness, which he knew he did not deserve, but merely for the chance to prove that he could become the husband she had deserved from the beginning, the partner worthy of her strength and grace and gentle nobility of spirit. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Vivienne moved through the day with the careful composure of someone performing a painful but necessary duty, folding gowns into trunks, wrapping small treasures in tissue, packing away the brief chapter of her life as Duchess of Ashford with methodical efficiency that masked the grief beneath. And though she had made her decision with clear eyes and sound reasoning, though she knew leaving was the only path to preserving what remained of her dignity and hope, still her hands trembled slightly as she placed each item away, and her heart felt like something heavy and bruised within her chest as the room gradually emptied of her presence, leaving behind only the ghost of what might have been if her husband had possessed the capacity to see her as anything more than an inconvenient obligation imposed by their family's political ambitions. And as evening shadows lengthened across her sitting room, she stood at the window, looking out over the grounds of Ashford Manor, committing to memory this place that had never quite become home, irresolute in her departure, yet unable to deny the small stubborn ache of sorrow for the marriage that had existed only in her hopes and never in reality, steeling herself for the final confrontation she sensed was coming, knowing that tomorrow she would leave, and that whatever the Duke might say or do tonight would not be enough to overcome 3 months of calculated cruelty and indifference, though some weak part of her heart whispered wishes she refused to acknowledge even to herself. Wednesday morning broke with a grey dawn that seemed to mirror the finality settling over Ashford Manor, and Vivienne descended the main staircase at first light, to find her trunks already loaded onto the carriage that waited in the circular drive, its horses stamping restlessly in the cold morning air, while servants stood at respectful distances, their faces reflecting a sorrow she had not expected to see, and she moved through these final moments with the careful composure of someone who has rehearsed this departure 1,000 times in her mind, accepting the quiet farewells of the housekeeper and the cook and the young maid who had served her with such devotion, maintaining her dignity even as her heart felt like something breaking slowly within her chest. She had reached the bottom step when the Duke appeared, and the sight of him stopped her cold. Allaric stood in the entrance hall looking utterly undone, his hair dishevelled as though he had run his hands through it countless times, his cravat askew, his eyes holding a desperation she had never witnessed in the 3 months of their marriage. And when he spoke her name it came out like a prayer or a plea, raw and unguarded, in a way that might have moved her if she had not spent these same 3 months learning to protect her heart against hope. He crossed the marble floor toward her, and the words that fell from his lips shattered what remained of his aristocratic pride, as he said simply, without preamble or pretense, "Please don't go." And she felt something twist inside her, even as she forced herself to meet his gaze with the cool distance she had perfected, responding in a voice that betrayed none of the turmoil beneath, "You have given me no reason to stay, Your Grace." The formality of the address seemed to strike him like a physical blow, and he stepped closer, his hands half raised as though he wanted to reach for her but did not dare, and he began to speak then of his cruelty, his blindness, his unforgivable treatment of her, words tumbling out in a confession that might have seemed rehearsed, except for the genuine anguish threading through every syllable, admitting that he had been wrong about everything, that he had failed her in ways he was only beginning to comprehend, that the thought of her leaving had become unbearable, and she listened to all of this, with her spine rigid and her expression carefully neutral, protecting herself against the seduction of his suddenly discovered conscience. When he finished, standing before her with his pride in ruins around him, she spoke with a firmness born of self-preservation, telling him that his sudden remorse came too late, that she would not remain in a marriage where she was valued only at the moment of losing her, that she deserved more than the scraps of regard he now offered when departure forced his hand. And she saw something crack in his expression, some last bastion of hope crumbling, but she could not let it sway her, could not let 3 months of pain be undone by one morning's desperate plea. She moved past him toward the door, and he did not try to stop her, did not command or demand or order as she half expected he might. And this restraint was somehow worse than force would have been, speaking to a transformation she could not afford to believe in, and she walked out into the grey morning and climbed into her carriage without looking back, giving the driver a nod that set the horses in motion, feeling the wheels begin their roll down the gravel drive that would carry her away from Ashford Manor and the husband who had broken her heart through casual cruelty and was now breaking it again through belated recognition of what he had and destroyed. And she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed forward, refusing to glance through the window at the grand house, receding behind her, refusing to acknowledge the tears that finally, in the privacy of the carriage, began their slow descent down her composed face. The carriage had rolled perhaps 30 yards down the gravel drive when something inside Allaric simply shattered, some final restraint breaking like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood, and he found himself running after it without conscious decision, his boots pounding the gravel as he called her name with a desperation that stripped away every last vestige of ducal dignity, and he had closed perhaps half the distance when his foot caught on a displaced stone, and he went down hard, his palms striking the sharp gravel of the drive, with a force that sent white-hot pain shooting up his arms as the broken edges of stone cut deep into his flesh. He should have stopped then, should have risen and retreated to the manor to tend his bleeding hands and salvage what remained of his pride. But pride had become meaningless in the face of losing her, and so he did something no Duke of Ashford had ever done. In the long and illustrious history of his family, he crawled forward on hands and knees through the gravel and broken stone, feeling sharp edges bite into his palms with each movement, leaving smears of crimson on the pale stones as he dragged himself toward her departing carriage, calling her name in a voice that broke on the syllables, transformed from the cold aristocrat who had sneered at her 3 months ago into something raw and desperate and entirely human. The servants who witnessed this scene would speak of it in hushed voices for years to come, how the proud Duke of Ashford crawled through his own drive like a beggar, his fine morning coat stained with dust and blood, his carefully cultivated composure shattered beyond recognition, and it was the coachman who saw him first and pulled the horses to a halt, uncertain what protocol demanded when one's employer was on his knees in the gravel, and through the carriage window Vivienne caught a glimpse of movement and turned to see her husband crawling toward her with bloodied hands and devastation written across every line of his face. She descended from the carriage in a rustle of traveling clothes, her own composure fracturing at the sight of him, and she stood frozen on the drive as he reached her and remained on his knees, looking up at her with eyes that held none of the arrogance she had endured for 3 months, only a terrible and naked vulnerability that made her chest tighten with emotions she could not name. And when he spoke, his voice was hoarse and broken as he said, "I was wrong, Vivienne. I was wrong about everything." He held up his bleeding hands as though they were an offering or a penance, the crimson staining his shirt cuffs and dripping onto the grey stones, and he continued in that same raw voice, "You're not beneath me. You were never beneath me. I'm beneath you. I have been, from the moment we met, and I was too blind and too proud and too much my father's son to see it, and I have no right to ask anything of you after how I've treated you. No right at all, but I am asking anyway because I cannot let you leave without you knowing that you are worth more than 1,000 men like me, that you are magnificent and strong and everything I should have cherished from the beginning, and if you still choose to go, then I will not stop you. But please, please know that losing you is the first real thing I have ever felt, and it is destroying me." The words hung in the cold morning air between them, and Vivienne stood looking down at this man who had been nothing but cruel indifference for months, now broken and bleeding at her feet, and she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack, even as she told herself that words spoken in desperation meant nothing, that this could be manipulation or pride wounded by rejection rather than genuine transformation. Yet still she could not look away from his bleeding hands, or the terrible honesty in his eyes as he knelt before her in the gravel, waiting for her judgment, like a condemned man waiting for sentence, and something in her heart that she had tried so hard to protect began to shift. Despite all her resolutions, despite every good reason she had to climb back into that carriage and never look back. The sight of him kneeling there with blood, staining the gravel beneath his hands, unlocked something in Vivienne that she had kept tightly controlled for 3 months. And suddenly all the anger she had suppressed came flooding out in a torrent of words that cut through the grey morning air like shards of glass, recounting every cruelty he had inflicted, from that first whispered dismissal at the altar to the countless cold shoulders and casual dismissals that had followed, reminding him of dinner parties where he had spoken over her as though she were invisible, of evenings where he had left her sitting alone in that vast dining room while he disappeared to visit his mistress. Of the morning, she had found her carefully written letters to him, sitting unopened in his study, as though her thoughts and feelings were too insignificant to warrant even a moment of his attention. And she spoke of the humiliation of being a wife in name only, a decoration in his grand house, valued less than the paintings on his walls. And as the words poured out, she felt years of training in composure and dignity crumbling away, leaving only the raw hurt of a woman who had tried so hard to be worthy of a man who had never once looked at her with anything but disdain. Allaric remained on his knees throughout this recitation of his failures, his bleeding hands hanging at his sides, and he did not interrupt or defend himself or offer any of the aristocratic justifications he might once have employed, instead simply accepting each accusation as though it were a deserved blow. And when she finally ran out of words and stood trembling before him, with tears streaming down her face, he said quietly, "You are right about all of it. Every word, and I have no defense to offer, because there is no defense for what I have done to you." And the simplicity of this acknowledgement, free from excuses or explanations, struck her as profoundly as his earlier confession had. He looked up at her then with eyes that held nothing but terrible honesty, and said, "I am not asking you to forgive me, Vivienne, because I know that what I have done is unforgivable, and I am not asking you to stay out of any obligation or duty or misguided sense of mercy, but I am asking for one thing that I have no right to request. I am asking for time to prove that I can become the husband you deserved from the beginning, and time to show you through actions rather than words that I am capable of change. And if after that time you still wish to leave, then I will not only let you go, but I will help you do so. I will give you whatever settlement you require, and I will speak to your family and the solicitors myself to ensure the annulment proceeds smoothly. But please, please give me a chance to be better than I have been." Vivienne stood frozen in indecision, her heart torn between the self-protective instinct that screamed at her to get back in the carriage and leave before he could hurt her again, and a small, fragile hope that perhaps this transformation might be real, that perhaps the broken man kneeling before her in the gravel represented something genuine rather than a performance designed to salvage his wounded pride. And she found herself thinking of all the small moments she had observed over the past weeks, the troubled expressions when he thought himself unobserved, and the gradual changes in his behavior that had begun even before he knew of her planned departure. And she realized that while his grand gesture of crawling after her carriage might have been dramatic, the foundation for change had perhaps been building more quietly beneath the surface. She drew a deep breath that trembled in her chest, and spoke words that surprised even herself as they emerged, telling him that she would grant him 1 month, 30 days, during which she would remain at Ashford Manor and observe whether his professed transformation held any substance, or whether it would dissolve like morning mist once the immediate crisis had passed. And she made it clear that this was not forgiveness or reconciliation, but rather a period of evaluation during which she would watch for genuine change rather than pretty words. And if at the end of that month she found his efforts lacking or insincere, she would leave without further discussion or debate, and he must accept that decision without argument or resistance. And as she laid out these conditions, she saw relief and gratitude, and something that might have been wonder flood across his bloodied, dust-stained face as he nodded agreement to terms that gave him far less than he might have hoped for, but infinitely more than he deserved. The first week of Vivienne's granted month unfolded with an awkwardness that permeated every corner of Ashford Manor, as Allaric attempted to navigate the unfamiliar territory of genuine courtesy toward the wife he had so thoroughly dismissed, and his efforts, while clearly sincere, bore the clumsy hallmarks of a man who had never before needed to consider another person's comfort or preferences, manifesting in small gestures that would have been unremarkable in any normal marriage, but which stood out starkly against the backdrop of their previous cold distance. He began appearing at breakfast, a meal he had previously taken alone in his study or skipped entirely, and would ask her with stilted formality how she had slept, and what her plans were for the day. Questions that seemed to cost him visible effort, as though he were learning a foreign language. And Vivienne answered these inquiries with careful politeness that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts, maintaining the protective distance she had promised herself, even as she observed his attempts with the sharp attention of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading the subtlest shifts in another's demeanor. She noticed that he dismissed Thompson, the head footman who had always treated her with barely concealed contempt, and when she inquired about this change through the housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, she learned that the Duke had personally dismissed 3 members of staff whose treatment of her had been less than respectful, a revelation that surprised her because she had not realized he had noticed such things at all, much less cared enough to take action, and this was followed by other changes that rippled through the household. Improved conditions in the servants' quarters that she had advocated for months ago without response, a sudden increase in wages for the lower staff, modifications to work schedules that allowed the maids and footmen more reasonable hours, all implemented quietly, as though Allaric hoped she might notice without his needing to draw attention to his efforts. On the 4th day of that first week, she found a package wrapped in brown paper on the small writing desk in her sitting room, and when she opened it with trembling fingers, she discovered 3 volumes of poetry that she had mentioned once, just once, in passing conversation with Mrs. Bramwell weeks ago as favorites from her childhood, books she had left behind when she married and had not thought of since, yet somehow he had remembered or discovered this detail and had them sent from London, and she stood holding those volumes with their worn leather covers and familiar gilt lettering, feeling something crack in the careful armor she had constructed around her heart, though she told herself sternly that kind gestures meant nothing without sustained change, that any man could perform acts of contrition when faced with losing something he had decided he wanted to keep. Vivienne continued her routine of managing the household and tending to correspondence, but now she did so with the constant awareness of being observed, of Allaric's presence, hovering at the edges of her activities, as though he were studying her, the way a scholar might study a text in an unfamiliar language, and she found this attention unsettling after months of being invisible, caught between suspicion that this was all performance and a dangerous flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, something genuine had shifted in the man who had once sneered that she was beneath him. And as the first week drew to a close, she realized with something like surprise that she had not yet packed her belongings again, that some part of her had decided to truly observe rather than simply wait for him to fail, and this realization brought both relief and terror in equal measure. The second week of Vivienne's trial month brought a transformation in their interactions that she had not anticipated, beginning on the 8th morning when Allaric appeared at the breakfast room with an expression of such careful determination that she immediately braced herself for some new plea or grand gesture, only to have him ask instead, with the hesitant formality of a student approaching a stern tutor, whether she might be willing to teach him the proper management of the estate accounts that she had been handling with such competence during his neglect, and though her first instinct was to refuse this request as yet another manipulation, something in the genuine uncertainty of his manner made her agree, and so they found themselves that afternoon in his study, a room she had entered only once before, seated across from each other at the broad mahogany desk, with ledgers and correspondence spread between them, like a bridge across months of cold distance. She began explaining the household accounts with professional detachment, pointing out the inefficiencies she had corrected and the improvements she had implemented. And at first, Allaric simply listened with the quiet attention of a man determined not to miss a single word, but gradually, as the afternoon wore on, their conversation deepened beyond the dry recitation of numbers and began to touch on matters of philosophy and approach, discussions about how the estate might better serve not just the family, but the tenants and workers who depended upon it, and she found herself surprised by the intelligence of his questions and the genuine interest he showed in concepts of stewardship and responsibility that went beyond mere profit. On the 3rd day of working together in this manner, as autumn light slanted through the study windows and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air between them, Allaric set down his pen and said with unexpected quietness, "My father ran this estate as though the people on it were merely tools to be used and discarded, and I realize now that I have done the same, not just to the tenants and servants, but to you most of all. And this acknowledgement opened a door to conversation that went far deeper than estate management, leading him to speak of his mother's death when he was barely 16, and of how his father had forbidden any display of grief and had instead pushed him immediately into society with instructions to harden himself against emotion, to view sentiment as weakness and distance as strength. And as Vivienne listened to this history, she began to see the architecture of cruelty that had shaped the man who had sneered at her on their wedding day, understanding for the first time that his coldness had been carefully constructed as armor against a world that had taught him love was dangerous and vulnerability was failure. She found herself sharing in turn, speaking of her own childhood and the loneliness of being raised as a piece in political negotiations rather than as a person, and of the training in silence and compliance that had prepared her to be a decorative wife to some man of higher rank. And there was something profoundly intimate about these exchanges that went beyond any physical closeness, a meeting of understanding between two people who had both been damaged by the aristocratic machinery that had brought them together. And she noticed how the walls of Allaric's study seemed to contract around them until the vast room felt almost cozy, noticed how their voices had softened to the tones people use when sharing secrets in the darkness. On the 5th day of that second week, as they reviewed a particularly complex set of tenant agreements, their hands brushed accidentally over a shared document, and Vivienne felt a jolt of awareness that was entirely different from the fear and anger that had characterized her previous responses to him, something that might have been the beginning of attraction, or perhaps simply the recognition of a kindred wounded soul. But whatever it was, it frightened her with its intensity, and she pulled her hand back sharply as though she had touched something hot, seeing in his eyes that he had felt it too, that same dangerous spark of connection. And for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the desk with all their careful formalities stripped away. And then she stood abruptly and excused herself with some invented need to speak with the housekeeper, fleeing the study and the unsettling realization that somewhere in these quiet afternoons of shared work and conversation, the man she had every reason to hate had begun to transform in her perception from monster to human, from tormentor to someone who might, just possibly, be capable of becoming something more. The third week of Vivienne's trial month brought a transformation that surprised them both, as the careful formality that had characterized their earlier interactions began to dissolve into something that resembled genuine friendship, a shift that manifested first in small moments of unexpected laughter during their continued work sessions. In the study, Allaric made a wry observation about a particularly pompous letter from a neighboring estate, and Vivienne found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in his presence, a sound that seemed to startle him before his own face broke into a smile of such unguarded pleasure that she felt her careful defenses waver. He began seeking her opinion not just in private but publicly during the twice-weekly meetings with the estate steward and land agent that she had never before been invited to attend, asking her thoughts on tenant improvements and crop rotations with a deference that clearly surprised the assembled men. And when old Mr. Hartley, the steward, hesitated to accept her suggestion about drainage improvements, Allaric cut him off sharply with the observation that the Duchess had proven herself far more competent in estate management than he himself had been for years, and his tone brooked no argument. And later that day, Vivienne overheard him instructing his secretary to ensure that all future estate correspondence be directed to her as well, cementing her authority in a way that would have seemed impossible mere weeks ago. On the 16th day of her remaining time at Ashford Manor, she noticed unusual activity in the east gardens, workmen clearing overgrown paths and pruning wild hedges, and when she inquired about this through Mrs. Bramwell, she learned that the Duke had ordered the restoration of his late mother's private garden, a space that had been left to ruin since the Dowager Duchess's death nearly a decade ago. And that evening, as Vivienne walked the portrait gallery as was her custom before dinner, Allaric found her there and asked with a hesitancy that seemed almost boyish whether she might like to see the progress on the garden, and she agreed with an equal measure of cautious curiosity. Following him through corridors she had never traversed to a door that opened onto a walled space that was slowly being transformed from wilderness back into beauty. They walked the cleared paths as twilight deepened around them, and he spoke of his mother with a tenderness she had never heard in his voice before, sharing memories of learning to read among these rose bushes, of her gentle corrections to his childhood arrogance, of the way she had tried to soften his father's harsh edicts, And Vivienne saw tears shine in his eyes as he touched the stone bench where the Dowager Duchess had loved to sit, and without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm in comfort, and for a long moment they stood like that in the gathering dusk, while evening birds sang overhead and the scent of autumn roses hung heavy in the air. When they finally returned to the house, walking side by side through corridors now lit by lamplight, Vivienne realized, with a start that she had begun to look forward to their time together, that the sharp edge of her anger had worn smooth through these weeks of patient attention. And this realization brought with it a surge of conflicting emotions, hope warring with fear, the dangerous desire to believe in his transformation, battling against the memory of every cruelty he had inflicted. And that night, as she prepared for bed, she found herself asking the question that terrified her most. Could she trust this change? Or was she simply allowing herself to be charmed by a skilled performer who would revert to coldness once he felt secure in her capitulation? And she lay awake for hours, wrestling with the understanding that her heart had already begun to soften toward the man she had every reason to hate, wondering whether this was wisdom or foolishness, whether she was witnessing genuine transformation or simply seeing what she desperately wanted to see. The fourth week of Vivienne's trial month arrived with the crisp certainty of late autumn, and she had begun to allow herself the dangerous luxury of hope, believing perhaps that the transformation she had witnessed in Allaric might be genuine and lasting, when on the 23rd day a carriage arrived at Ashford Manor, bearing a woman whose arrival shattered the fragile peace they had been constructing with such painstaking care. Lady Celeste Ravenshaw descended onto the gravel drive in a rustle of expensive silk and barely concealed fury, her beauty sharp and cold as winter frost, and Vivienne knew with sickening certainty, even before Mrs. Bramwell's whispered explanation, that this was the mistress, come to reclaim what she clearly considered her rightful place in the Duke's life, and the entire household seemed to hold its breath as the woman demanded an immediate audience with Allaric, with the entitled tone of someone accustomed to having her demands met. Vivienne retreated to the morning room with what dignity she could muster, her hands trembling as she took up needlework she had no hope of completing, listening to the raised voices that carried from Allaric's study despite the thick oak doors, and though she could not make out words, she heard the sharp accusatory pitch of Lady Ravenshaw's voice and braced herself for the inevitable moment when Allaric would choose the easier path, would perhaps ask Vivienne quietly to withdraw back to her family's estate to avoid the scandal that this confrontation threatened to unleash. But instead what came was silence, followed by the sound of the study door opening, and then Allaric's voice carrying with cold clarity through the entrance hall, as he said loudly enough for every servant to hear, "Lady Ravenshaw, you will leave my home immediately, and you will not return, as I have already made abundantly clear in my letters these past weeks. My association with you is ended permanently, and my marriage to the Duchess is sacred and inviolable, and I will not tolerate any attempt to besmirch her honor or disturb her peace." Vivienne set down her needlework with shaking hands and moved to the doorway in time to see Lady Ravenshaw's face transform from shock to venomous rage, to hear her spit accusations about Allaric's previous declarations of affection and promises of continued arrangement, and to watch as he stood unmoved and replied with devastating finality, "Whatever I said before was spoken by a man who did not understand the difference between shallow pleasure and genuine worth, and I was wrong in every regard, and you will leave now or I will have you escorted from the premises." The woman departed in a storm of threats about social ruin and public scandal, and Allaric stood in the entrance hall watching her carriage disappear down the drive before turning to find Vivienne observing from the morning room doorway. And something in his expression, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, made her heart clench, even as old wounds began to throb with renewed pain, because she found herself wondering in the silence that followed whether his defense of her had been motivated by genuine feeling or simply by aristocratic pride, by the determination not to be seen as a man who could be manipulated by a discarded mistress. And that night when he sought her out in the library where she had gone to escape her own thoughts, she confronted him with a directness born of desperation, asking him with her voice barely steady, "Was that performance today about protecting me or about protecting your reputation? Because I need to know, Allaric. I need to understand whether your transformation is real or whether you are simply a better actor than I gave you credit for, whether you defend me because you truly see my worth, or because you cannot bear the humiliation of having your cast-off lover create a scandal. She saw him flinch as though she had struck him. He saw the color drain from his face as he absorbed the implications of her question. And in the lamplight of the library, with rain beginning to patter against the windows like tears, they faced each other across a chasm of distrust that suddenly seemed as wide as it had been on the day she had ordered her carriage prepared for departure. And she realized with aching clarity that despite all the progress of these weeks, despite the friendship and understanding they had built, the foundation of their relationship was still cracked by the cruelty of their beginning, and she did not know if any amount of patient reconstruction could truly repair what had been so thoroughly broken. For a long moment after Vivienne's devastating question hung in the rain-shadowed library, Allaric stood motionless, and she watched as something in his carefully constructed composure finally shattered completely, his shoulders sagging as though under an unbearable weight. And when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before, stripped of all aristocratic polish and pretense. "You ask if I defend you out of pride or genuine feeling," he said quietly, moving closer but stopping well short of touching her, respecting the space she needed even in this moment of crisis. "And the truth, Vivienne, the truth that I have been too cowardly to speak plainly until now, is that I have fallen utterly and irreversibly in love with you, and I do not know precisely when it happened. Perhaps it was watching you manage my household with more grace and competence than I had ever shown. Perhaps it was seeing the kindness you extended to servants I had never truly noticed. Perhaps it was the moment I realized you were leaving and felt as though the ground had opened beneath my feet. But somewhere in these months I stopped seeing you as the unwanted wife forced upon me by arrangement, and began seeing you as the most remarkable woman I have ever known, someone whose strength and dignity and quiet courage make me ashamed of every cruel word I ever spoke, of every dismissive gesture I ever made." She felt tears beginning to blur her vision but refused to let them fall, holding herself rigid as he continued, his words tumbling out now with desperate honesty. "I defended you today not because my pride demanded it, but because the thought of anyone speaking ill of you makes me want to tear the world apart. Because you have become more precious to me than my reputation, or my position, or anything else I once thought mattered. And I know I have no right to these feelings. I know that I forfeited any claim to your affection when I sneered that you were beneath me on the day we wed, when I treated you with coldness and contempt while you showed nothing but dignity in return." He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture of profound distress, and she could see that his hands were trembling. "I do not deserve your forgiveness, Vivienne. I do not deserve even the chance you have given me these past weeks, because I was cruel when you deserved kindness, indifferent when you deserved attention, and blind to your worth when I should have been grateful for the extraordinary gift of your presence in my life. And if you wish to leave even now, if you have decided that my transformation came too late or is insufficient to overcome the damage I inflicted, then I will let you go. I will sign whatever papers your solicitor requires, and I will not contest the annulment, because loving you means wanting your happiness even if it means my own devastation." The confession seemed to drain something essential from him, and he sank into the nearest chair, as though his legs would no longer support him, looking up at her with eyes that held such naked vulnerability that her own carefully maintained defenses began to crack, despite her determination to protect her heart. "But I need you to know," he said softly, "that regardless of what you decide, you have transformed me in ways I cannot fully articulate. You have shown me what it means to live with honor and compassion, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the man you saw potential in, even when I gave you every reason to see only the monster I had become." Vivienne found her voice at last, though it emerged barely above a whisper, and she heard herself saying the words she had not known she was ready to speak until they fell from her lips like rain. "I am falling in love with you too, Allaric, and that terrifies me more than anything else in this world, because I do not know if I can trust these feelings, if I can risk my heart on a transformation that might prove temporary, if I can forgive completely enough to build something real on the ruins of what was broken." She saw hope flare in his eyes even as she continued, "But I also know that I do not wish to leave, not truly, not anymore, and that realization leaves me vulnerable in ways I swore I would never allow again." He rose slowly, approaching her with the careful reverence one might show a wild creature that might flee at any sudden movement, and when he spoke again, his voice held a promise that resonated with absolute sincerity. "Then I will wait," he said. "I will prove myself for as long as it takes, whether that is weeks or months or years. I will show you every day through my actions that my love is genuine and my transformation is permanent, and I will never stop trying to earn the trust I so carelessly destroyed, because you, Vivienne, are worth every effort, every sacrifice, every moment of patience it requires." The library held them in its silence for several heartbeats after Allaric's promise, and Vivienne felt something fundamental shift within her, like ice breaking on a river after a long winter, and she realized with sudden clarity that fear had been her constant companion for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to choose hope instead, and to risk her heart on the possibility that transformation could be genuine and love could grow even in soil poisoned by cruelty. And so she took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff and said quietly, "Then I choose to try, Allaric. I choose to open my heart and see where this path leads us, because I am tired of protecting myself from what might hurt me and missing what might heal me instead." She saw his expression transform with such profound relief and gratitude that it made her own eyes sting with tears, and when he reached for her hand this time she did not pull away, but let her fingers intertwine with his, feeling the calluses he had earned from working alongside the groundskeeper to restore his mother's garden, physical evidence of his commitment to change. They stood there in the lamplight with rain still whispering against the windows, and slowly, carefully, with the tentative reverence of two people who had nearly lost each other before they ever truly found one another, Allaric drew her closer, one hand rising to cup her face with such gentleness that she felt her last defenses crumble, and when his lips finally met hers, it was nothing like she had imagined. In her most secret thoughts, it was not passionate or demanding, but tender and uncertain, a question rather than a claim, a promise sealed with vulnerability rather than possession. She kissed him back with her whole heart, tasting salt from tears she had not realized were falling, feeling months of loneliness and pain beginning to transform into something precious and new, and when they finally drew apart, they simply held each other while the storm outside intensified. Two people who had begun as strangers bound by duty, discovering that they might become partners bound by choice and love. The weeks that followed saw their relationship blossom like late-season roses, unexpected and all the more beautiful for having survived early frost, and they learned each other slowly, carefully, building trust through accumulated kindnesses and shared vulnerabilities, through long conversations in the library and quiet mornings working side by side in the estate office, and through laughter that came more easily with each passing day, and touches that grew gradually less tentative as fear yielded to familiarity. Allaric proved his transformation not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through asking for her opinion and genuinely listening to her answers, through introducing her to business associates as his partner rather than merely his wife, through the 100 small ways he demonstrated daily that he valued her mind and her presence and her heart. By the time winter arrived in earnest, covering Ashford Manor in pristine snow, Vivienne had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with the man her husband had become, and when he suggested quietly that they might renew their vows in the spring, this time speaking words they both meant with their whole hearts, she agreed with joy that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The ceremony took place in his mother's restored garden on a morning when apple blossoms drifted like snow and the air smelled of growth and possibility, and before their closest friends and the household staff who had witnessed their entire journey, Allaric took her hands and said clearly, "You are not beneath me, you never were. You are beside me and above me, and the greatest blessing of my undeserving life." And Vivienne replied with equal conviction, "I choose you, not because arrangement demands it, but because my heart desires it, not because duty requires it, but because love compels it." When they kissed this time, it was before witnesses who cheered their union, and Vivienne thought of the cold cathedral where they had first wed, and marveled at how far they had traveled from that bleak beginning. How patient, love, and genuine transformation had turned what began as a prison into a partnership that made both of them better than they had been alone. 5 years had passed since that spring morning when Vivienne and Allaric renewed their vows in the restored garden, and Ashford Manor had been transformed in ways that extended far beyond its physical beauty, becoming a place of warmth and laughter and genuine happiness where once cold indifference had reigned. And on this particular afternoon in late summer, Vivienne stood at the library window watching their 3 children play among the roses. Eleanor, named for Alaric's mother, chasing her younger brothers, Thomas and James, through the paths, while their father pretended to be a fearsome dragon they must outwit, and she felt her heart swell with a contentment so profound it sometimes still surprised her, this abundance of joy built on the ruins of what had nearly been her greatest sorrow. Allaric caught her watching and smiled, that particular smile he reserved only for her, full of love and gratitude, and the quiet wonder of someone who knew how close he had come to losing everything that mattered. And later, when the children had been settled with their governess, and the house had fallen into evening quiet, they walked together through the garden, as had become their custom, her hand secure in his, discussing estate matters and family concerns, and the 1,000 ordinary intimacies of a partnership built on genuine respect and deepening affection. "Do you ever think about that morning when you nearly left?" he asked softly, as they paused beside the fountain where water caught the last golden light of sunset, and Vivienne considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I think about how close I came to protecting my heart by closing it completely, how fear nearly convinced me that safety was worth more than the possibility of love, and I am grateful every day that I found the courage to risk hope instead of certainty, to choose transformation over bitterness." He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become habitual over the years, but had never lost its tenderness, and she saw in his eyes the man who had crawled through broken gravel rather than let her go, the man who had shattered his pride and rebuilt himself into someone worthy of the second chance she had granted. But now, dear listener, I must step away from their story to speak directly to your heart, because Vivienne and Alaric's journey holds truths that extend beyond the boundaries of their particular lives, lessons about the nature of transformation and the courage required to look beneath surfaces and see potential where others might see only brokenness. We live in a world that often encourages us to protect ourselves by refusing second chances, to guard our hearts so carefully that we miss the possibility of genuine change. And while wisdom certainly requires us to recognize when someone's cruelty is immutable, there exists also a place for patient observation of authentic transformation, for the kind of hope that sees not what someone has been, but what they are becoming. Vivienne's story teaches us that strength lies not in maintaining our walls forever, but in being brave enough to lower them when someone proves through consistent action that they have truly changed. And Allaric's journey reminds us that even those who have caused great pain can find redemption if they are willing to do the difficult work of genuine transformation, to shatter their pride and rebuild themselves with humility and intentional change. Perhaps you too have known the ache of being dismissed or diminished, or perhaps you have been the one who must reckon with cruelty you have inflicted. And whatever your circumstance, I hope you will remember that healing is possible, that love can grow even in unlikely soil, and that second chances, when earned through genuine effort and granted with careful wisdom, can lead to joy more profound than first chances ever promised. May you find the courage to risk hope when it is warranted, the wisdom to recognize authentic change when you see it, and the grace to build something beautiful on the foundation of what was once broken. And may your days be filled with the kind of love that transforms rather than diminishes, that lifts rather than crushes, that sees you as you truly are and cherishes every part of who you have become. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Vivienne and Alaric's transformation, and if this story touched your heart, we invite you to explore more tales of redemption and unexpected love on our channel. And until we meet again in another story, may you rest well in the knowledge that change is always possible, and love, true love, is always worth the risk. Sleep peacefully, dear listener, and dream of gardens where broken things bloom again.